landscape for DRI. As you are aware, this session has been divided into 3 simultaneous sessions. The session T2-A on large investments in new infrastructure will be chaired by Y.Mathur, Additional Secretary, NITI Aayog, India, and moderated by Bruwer, Department of Cooperative Governance, South Africa. This session will be held in this hall here. The session T2-B, focus on refurbishment and replacement of existing infrastructure, will be chaired by Luke Brown from Emergency Management Australia. This session will be held at Diwan-e Khas. The session T2-C on small island developing states and landlocked developing countries will be chaired by Colonel Ariona, National Emergency Management Agency, Mongolia, and moderated by Etienne Coet, European Commission. This session will be held at Aftab Mehtab. We will reassemble here at 3:45 p.m. for a discussion on the deliberations. I request... Sorry, there's a change in the agenda here. We will reassemble at 4:30 for after tea for technical session 3. I now request the chair and the speakers for T2-A and T2-B to proceed to the designated halls. Other participants may choose to attend the session that interests them the most.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we can start. So my name is Y.Mathur and I work for the National Institution for Transforming India. And some of you may be aware, it is the successor organization of the Planning Commission of India. And it is chaired by the Prime Minister. And it has a governing council comprising of other ministers from the federal government as well as the chief ministers of the country. And one of the tasks of this think tank is to, kind of be prepared for disruptions and bring in the agenda that actually impacts not only change, but transforming India. It's a large mandate, and a critical part of that is building new infrastructure for a country like ours. And I head the knowledge and innovation vertical of this organization. And we have been, over the past, maybe 30, 40 years, the erstwhile Planning Commission, driving infrastructure and setting the agenda for resource allocation pan-India. But now, recognizing the needs of a country like ours and the large role that the private sector plays in building cities, building infrastructure, the first transformation really is greater partnerships and designing our 100 smart cities and designing infrastructure in partnership, and then actually executing, implementing those infrastructure projects with standard concession documents and bidding documents. So NITI Aayog, the organization I work, we are at the cutting edge to guide the state governments as well as the federal ministries as they execute infrastructure projects, whether it is roads, highways, the entire scenario. So we are guiding them in what kind of documents they may choose to use when they go out for bidding. We are encouraging greater long-term contracts where it is not just an EPC contractor, but shifting the whole paradigm to long-term maintenance embedded into the infrastructure project. And that is when resilient, designing and preparing the country to create infrastructure, prepare, like the earlier presenter was mentioning, it is so critical that we need to really build it around partnerships, build it around, sharing of the learnings and understanding, a better understanding of the future shocks and really break the silos. And I think one of the big challenges we look at is data. So maybe as we go in the panel discussion, we'll try to look at where is the data about the cities, about infrastructure, how is it being collected. It's not only but we really need to be preparing our infrastructure for the 5G and the future when infrastructure actually continues to generate data, and then to design our whole urban habitats where data is easily accessible and it can be reacted and worked upon in real time. So I encourage a lot of startups in India and companies to start sharing data and go in for the preparation that will be needed as the 5G kicks in. We have a national plan to actually have 5 billion IoTs. So it's about really getting ready for embedded sensors, getting data, what kind of protocols will be required, and how will infrastructure actually start talking real time to the control command centers. And so we are looking at already India, out of these 100 smart cities, there are more than 30 control and command centers already in place. And I was in a city called Allahabad, Kumbh, where we have one of the largest congregations of humanity in one dense 25 square kilometer area. More than 50 million people come and they cut across that city in a period of 48 hours. So that so new city comes up in a 30 square kilometer core area surrounded by a periphery of another 200 square kilometers, and a new city comes up. Literally in 6 months' time, a city is built up which provides accommodations. There were over 500,000 toilets built up there, temporary toilets, temporary sewage, roads and power connections and hospitals and crowd control. So whole new cities you can see come up in India when these religious congregations happen. And it is an amazing story, and we are trying to document that. And it cost over $1 billion for the UP government and the central government. So $1 billion of infrastructure gets built up just for this period of 45 days. And then the city unravels. It's a tented accommodation, no permanent structures allowed because it is on the river beds, the flatlands around the rivers, no permanent construction. But the administrative and execution challenges, and of course we are clear there cannot be a disaster, but there could be theoretically in such small dense areas. So any kind of disaster could strike, of course, fire and outbreak of illnesses, I think the opportunities in India are immense for data capture, and I encourage startups to start working for the new generation. But with these preliminary remarks, I will rest. I will request the moderator to take on, and then she could introduce the panel, and I think you have a structure on how you want to proceed.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Bruwer. I represent South Africa. I'm from the National Disaster Management Center in South Africa. I think we all realize that infrastructure has the power to enable smooth functioning of our economies. And this session specifically addresses economies where a large amount of investment is expected in new infrastructure, building of new infrastructure, and especially in emerging countries. The focus in these contexts is in putting in place the regulatory and governance context and the structures that would be necessary to ensure that construction and maintenance of infrastructure is getting implemented effectively in countries. So we are looking at the big picture, we're looking at the policy environment, we're looking at the governance structures, and the session will advance thinking on these issues for these specific type of economies. So some of the questions that we'll be dealing with is what are good examples where leadership of the national or regional government is providing a coherent basis for decision making to inform investment in risk, inform investments. Then also, how is resilience to infrastructure approached in different economic and geographical contexts? What are the critical issues in governance systems that drive these matters and decisions? And what are the potential areas of partnerships between countries that may be forged under the CDRI to address these issues and improve practice? So those are the questions that we're trying to address during this session, and our esteemed panel will be helping us through this process. So we have representatives here from the National Institute for Urban Affairs from India, also from Argentina, and we also have a representative from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water of India. Is that correct? And we also have some discussants during this panel. So let us not waste time, and let's ask the first presenter to give us an overview. And I believe you are from the Institute for Urban Affairs of India.
Good afternoon, everyone. As the PowerPoint was getting loaded, I just wanted to tell you a story about, two friends, an automobile engineer and, a heart surgeon meeting at a conference after a long time. When both were discussing their career progression, all of a sudden the automobile designer realized that, the cardiosurgeon is making much more money than me. And then he started arguing like, you're working on the same systems, but of course it's a human body, but human body has similar function as an automobile. It has an engine and it has a control system. Why do you end up earning more than me? And for which the cardiosurgeon replied, try fixing a car when it is moving. So that's pretty much the stage where we are in, We are trying to bring in infrastructure into a city which is quite dynamic, and it is dynamic not only by new migrants coming in, but also the landscape keeps changing quite rapidly. New buildings do get constructed, and a person who's supplying water systems or providing water to, a community, all of a sudden a high-rise building starts to emerge in that locality, and now he has to rethink, rechange the supply mechanism, starting from 1,000 people to more than 10,000 people in the same area. So that is a challenge which we are facing, but that said, there's quite a bit of investment, at least in India, which the government is already making. And the figures are here. I don't want to read the figures, but what is more important to note is the figure of urban investments or investments in infrastructure is quite massive. What's going to come up in the next 10, 20 years, not only in the urban areas, but also in the rural areas, just to catch up on the deficit which has occurred over the last few years. And as we develop, new technologies and new mechanisms are coming in place. And as the landscape changes, new risks do emerge, not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas. And how does one actually address that? Just to go into some of the initiatives, and of course there is a huge amount of investment in infrastructure, which is $92 billion, which is going to come up. And there is a program which the government is already conducting, which is almost in its, fifth year right now, is the Smart Cities program, where $32 billion have been invested. And compared to the kind of investment which the government is making, it's actually negligible to the investments which individuals and households are making. Just to give you an example, for every 10 meters of water supply pipeline, which the municipal corporation or the municipal government is providing to a household, the household has an underground tank. It then builds an overhead tank for its local supply. It also has these meters of pipeline connecting the underground, overhead, and also the different utilities, kitchen and bathroom within the household. And above all, they also go about getting themselves an RO system to purify the water, irrespective of what the government does in terms of purification and sending it. So the amount of investments which the government is making, which you're seeing over there in the slide, is actually quite a lot. But the amount of investments which people are going to make in their own personal individual infrastructure within communities are at large. And why the risk resilience is quite important in India is because the emergence of shocks and stresses have been quite large, at least over the last 10 years. Of course, there is a climate change, and people are saying that over the last 2 decades, at least for the last 15 years, 13 of them were the most hottest, you know. But apart from it, this is a broad statistics, you know, for India. Over the last 2 decades, the extent of losses which the disasters have caused across the country is quite large. And these are, if you look at the numbers, it seems millions, but actually it is $1,000 US. So it is billions of dollars which are getting lost irrespective of the investment which is being made. So it is not only to look at climate change, because there you get to see extreme temperature and floods, but there are also losses because of landslides, because of earthquake, because of other things like epidemic, which are you know, post-disaster events, which needs to be taken into consideration while designing infrastructure. And this is a rough figure from the smart cities. You know, there are 100 smart cities where $30 billion are being invested by the government. And this gives a rough idea about the kind of exposure these cities have. You can see much of the cities, of course, the Amrut is another program which covers 500 cities across the country. And as you can see, many of the cities, that is 24 smart cities, that is 1/4 of the smart cities, and 1/5 of the Amrut cities are in a very high disaster risk zone. But the investments and for the infrastructure and the infrastructure are getting built as we speak today. So what the government is doing, of course, there are a lot of national level policies and frameworks which are currently in place. There are guidelines which are in place. And NDMA has come up with the guidelines for state governments and also for the urban areas. At the same time, the national government has also recently come up, which is the MOHUA has come up with SOPs for urban floods specifically, and they are also thinking about how to mainstream disaster risk resilience within urban areas. Especially there are building codes and bylaws which are getting modified as we speak, and most of the time the bylaws are very state dependent and city dependent in many cases. And coastal zone regulations are being re-looked at, and of course the guidelines for roads and highways are being thought about. And the Ministry of Civil Aviation is also looking at not only the airports, but also the surrounding villages in terms of how to look at it from a risk resilience point of view. Because most of the time, if anything happens within the airport, the villages or the people around it are the first respondents. And how do you train them? In many cases, the airports are situated outside the city limits, and many of the time it is villages around these areas. So how do you build resilience not only in people reacting to it, but also the infrastructure to cater to it? And of course, the telecom department is also thinking around standard operating procedures for managing disaster. Because I remember the 2001 post-Gujarat earthquake, for 2 days, the first and foremost thing which got disconnected were the telephone connectivity. And more than the disaster, it is the panic which sets in across the country for people's loved ones, whether they are doing fine, they are doing okay, is the only way to communicate is mobile phones, or nowadays it's mobile phone. Earlier it was landline STDs and ISDs. So looking at telecommunication becomes very important, not only for connecting people, but also for crisis management. I'm just going to go through some of the things which the government is doing. Of course, this is not a comprehensive list, but there are thought processes which are in play. And what I invite is people to network, and of course, work with MOHUA and NIUA towards building and supporting some of these initiatives which are happening over there. The first and foremost is the URDPFI guidelines, which is the Urban and the Regional Development Plan formulation. These guidelines are in place, and there are possibilities of improvements within that. And right now, the new urban agenda for the country is currently in place, and it has been posted online for comments and reviews for people to comment upon it. And they are thinking about adding a new section on risk resilience, more and also including air pollution within it. So that is something which is ongoing. Urban flooding, like I said, the SOPs for urban floodings are in place, but there is a lot more which needs to be done when designing and implementing infrastructure projects within the cities. Because right now the flood models which exist within cities are at a very, very coarse resolution. And with the changing dynamics and the changing landscape, and also some of the natural drainages which gets destroyed or covered in the process of development needs to be relooked into. So how does one develop a dynamic flood model, and how does one take into account the the complexities of urban terrain into consideration while coming up with not only because it's easy to build a flood resilient structure, but it is very complex to understand what will be the level of flooding for a kind of rainfall, because it is not evenly distributed across the city. And also for local level, changes where people influence it, the drains are not cleaned or cleaned, and highways are getting constructed, flyovers are getting constructed. While the construction is happening, what will be the impact and what will be the change in the flood situation across the city needs to be considered. And there are also certain things which are being brought into play at the national level. One of the things is the Ease of Living Index 2.0, which is now at least started considering the Ease of Living Index is not only the quality of services, but it is also having some of the indicators around resilience. Recently on 26th of last month, the government launched the Climate Smart City Framework under the Smart Cities Mission. So it's going to be a sub-grant, and cities are going to be monitored every 6 months for the next 5 years on their performance towards climate-informed infrastructure building, especially around smart cities. And of course, Amrut and the Cities program, which is an AFD-funded program, is looking at urban resilience as one of its key components within the project design and implementation, especially across 15 cities in the country for the Cities program and 500 cities for the Amrut program. And the Urban Resilience Unit, which is set up at NIUA, is currently looking at how to mainstream resilience. And this unit is currently being funded by the 100 Resilience City, and it's looking at mainstreaming resilience across the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that insight and practical experience. Let us ask our next presenter, Mr. Zhang from Emergency Management Office in China, to do his presentation. And I would like to appeal to the presenters that we stick to the 10 minutes so that we can also allow time for some discussion at the end of the session. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Zhang Xuehua from MEM China. Now, as one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, China has always put disaster prevention, risk reduction and relief on the top of his political agenda. President Xi Jinping has made a series of important remarks on it, especially in recent years, which has laid up new modernity, conception and requirement for future work. He had made clear that disaster prevention, risk reduction, and relief concern not only the safety of people's life and property, but also the harmony of the stability of our society. It is an important task to test the leadership of the ruling party and implement capacity of the government. It will also prove whether our nation is capable enough to mobilize the social resource and stand as a unity. Therefore, in the last year, we established the Ministry of Emergency Management to integrate the emergency response, resource and efforts, lead and coordinate disaster prevention, risk reduction of relief, in order to build China's emergency management institution with united command, combination of especially of the regular capacities, response efficiency, central of the local coordination, and the integrate of the routine, preparedness, and emergency response. And on October 10th last year, Ms. T made another important remarks on improving national capacity of disaster prevention and management. He stressed that disaster prevention and management is a priority to ensure national development and the people's interests. Therefore, it is needed to shift our focus to disaster prevention and combining prevention, response, and relief, enhance, integrate disaster risk reduction, and take coordinated disaster management action so as to modernize our disaster management institutions and capacities. In accordance with Mr. Xi instructions, we are and will continue to adopt the people's-oriented approach to manage multi-hazard and the whole process of natural disasters, leaders, and coordination resource and technology for application, so as to comprehensively improve disaster management and capacity and better protect our people. In view of the key areas and weak link, 9 key projects are deployed. First, carry out disaster risk and investigation and key hidden danger investigation project. Second, implementing economic restoration project in key economic function area and restore the function of forest, grassland, river and lake, wetland, disaster and marine ecosystem. Third, implement coastal protect and restore project, building economic seawall and enhance the ability to withstand typhoon, storm, and other marine disasters. Fourth, implement building facility reinforcement project in earthquake-prone areas to prune earthquake resistance and disaster prevention capabilities. Fifth, implement flood control and drought relief water conversion upgrade project. Sixth, the comprehensive management of geological hazards and recognition of marine of world danger will be carried out, and the relocking geological hazard during the 13 5-year plan will be carried out well. Seventh, we will implement the construction project of emergency rescue center and build self-regional emergency request centers. Eighth, we will implement an information-based project for monitoring and early warning of the natural disaster and improve the comprehensive monitoring, risk early identification, and early warning capabilities of varying type of the disaster and disaster channel. 9, we will carry out the modernization project of the technology and equipment for natural disaster prevention and control, intensify efforts and to tackle key technology and improve the level of the special technology and equipment for rescue team in China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zhang. I think we have learned from some of the practical examples and measures that you have already implemented in China. We now call on to Mr. Sebastian Alonso, the Director of Public Works Planning, Ministry of the Interior, Public Works and Housing from the Government of Argentina, to give us a presentation. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Argentina is a country that is highly exposed to natural and anthropogenic hazards, and at the same time presents conditions of vulnerability of different origins. This double condition places the country in a place of high exposure to disaster risk. Historically, the main management problem of our cities was related to the scarce relationship between national, provincial, or municipal public investment and planning, in which the synergy of public efforts that affect the same territory was lost or incompatible actions were developed among them. Territorial planning and ordering are vital to prevent and mitigate risk. As part of this policy, Secretary of Territorial Planning and Federal Public Works was created, aimed to developing long-term public policies and prioritizing investment over current expenditure, in addition to coordinating all the activities regarding to reconstruction fees following an emergency, after the disaster occurred and after the rehabilitation phase. Argentina is a federal country. In consequence, the implementation of these policies requires the active participation of the different levels of government. Therefore, we work together with provinces and townships to articulate systemic and coordinated solutions, from the process of identification and weighting of projects to the generation of effective instruments for urban land management. This process is based on the Territorial Strategic Plan, where work strategies are proposed, linking planning stages, projects, and works as a continuous process, transparent and traceable. Strategically planned provide assistance in the ordering of land use with sustainability criteria and coordinate between jurisdictions seeking public investment. It is a question of linking in a continuous process three main stages: the plan, the project, and the work. Planning itself is a four-phase subsystem. In the first phase, it is proposed based on existing territorial plans and information to identify urban problems and potentialities. In the second phase, a desired local development model is defined and priorities and strategies are established. In the next phase, the programs that organize a portfolio of projects are defined, and as well as opportunities and key actors. Finally, the strategic projects phase establishes a prioritized list of projects according to the specific weighting criteria. The planned project work sequence continues with the development of viability and pre-investment studies that analyze in detail cost, budgets, and sources of financing for each project, and the design of the executive projects. This process ends with the execution of programs and works. The subsequent measurement of the results feeds back into the planning based on the evaluation and monitoring of impact. Associating the work to the project and this to the plan constitutes a new perspective of public investment that gives rationality to decision-making, improves the effectiveness of planning, and guides it to obtain concrete results. Likewise, it facilitates the relationship between the government areas seeking to overcome the sectoriality that has traditionally characterized the execution of urban and territorial policies. In summary, the main work strategies are to link the stages of planning, projects, and works as a continuous, transparent, and traceable process, to plan strategically and provide assistance in the ordering of land uses with sustainability criteria, develop a national strategic territorial planning and evaluate its results, interjurisdictional coordination of a public investment, assist locals and provincial governments in the development of territorial plans, regulation, and the management of the programs to strengthen territorial plannings, analyze and incorporate risk management in land use planning and infrastructure projects, prepare diagnostics for the identification of priorities for action and the definition of public policies for the different urban scales in the country, develop and implement methodologies and information instruments that strengthen territorial planning, projects development, and works management, establish, update, and manage a system of indicators that allows monitoring the transformations in the territory and the progress, its goals, and results of the plans and investments made. Integrated disaster risk management should be understood as a continuous process that involves all social actors in the various stages of the process, from planning, prevention, and mitigation of phenomena that could cause damage to people, goods or the ecosystem of a given community, to rehabilitation and reconstruction actions after the disaster. Therefore, this must be cross-cutting actions regarding public policies. On the one hand, land use planning makes it possible to prevent risk, since it implies a guide for the location of activities and investment, discarding the construction of infrastructure or equipment in areas where there is a menace. The acknowledgement of menaces and the possible risk implies being able to detect the necessary works to reduce or mitigate the risk and define their particular design. On the other hand, the reconstruction phase focuses on not repeating past mistakes. For example, relocating homes in flood areas, rebuilding roads without the appropriate design, etc. And also constructing works that mitigate or reduce the risk, such as defenses, slope treatments, construction of catchment works, conduction and delivery of runoff waters, containment works, treatment of watercourses, and so on. Likewise, arbitrary use of resources in reconstruction plans is eliminated due to the fact that they are signaled in the previous planning stage, and all actions are then carried out within a framework of agreements already defined by the territorial strategic plan, and do not involve new emergency budget items, reducing the reconstruction operation times. The new management paradigm is materialized through the creation of the National System for Integrated Risk Management, integrated by the three levels of the state, civil society and non-governmental organizations that focusing on risk prevention and reduction, also develops yearly intervention protocols to mitigate the impacts of an eventual disaster. The project and works management platform is a virtual The project and works management platform is a virtual platform of public access that allows to integrate and articulate the decisions on public investments in the territory and achieves the interaction of all the actors during the process of development of the projects. The platform is composed by the project portfolio manager, where each organization uploads its projects, linking them with plans, strategies, and territorial policies, which will go through various stages of approval and implementation. The project banks organizes the progress of these projects in an efficient, fluid, transparent, and orderly process. It currently contains more than 13,000 projects. The work systems itself to monitor them, the monitoring system to analyze the impact of public investments in the territory, and the georeferenced information system. At the same time, the building information modeling methodology is implemented as a tool for planning, designing, constructing, managing, operating, and maintaining buildings and infrastructures, which allows to lower construction costs, improve transparency in investment decisions, and simpler replication. Finally, technical and financial assistance programs were implemented, as well as training in various topics and the provision of technological equipment and specific software as a part of the assistance to local governments. To conclude, here is a brief example of a reconstruction plan prepared for the city of Comodoro Rivadavia in the province of Chubut in Argentina's Patagonia. All this information can be found in the technical support documents and can be consulted on the Secretariat's website. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those practical case studies and also indicating the measures that you have put in place in Argentina to deal with building disaster resilience into your planning process. Allow me now to introduce our next contributor, Ms. Ishita Jalan. She's also from India, specifically from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ishita Jalan from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. It's a policy research think tank. And to add to the discussions that we've had so far, I would like to discuss specific case studies from India. So I'm covering Indian cities, Amravati, which is the new capital of Andhra Pradesh, and the new proposed smart cities from Madhya Pradesh, Bhopal, Indore, and Jabalpur. The study that we did at CEW was done in collaboration with the University of East Anglia and Mott MacDonald. What I want to bring first in this discussion is that the climate projections have been determined that they would be increasing. The temperature and rainfall would be seen as an upward trend in the climate projections, but also with an increased frequency of extreme patterns. Now, to give a specific example for, say, Amravati, for the RCP 8.5 scenario, there would be an increase in 1.8 degrees Celsius by 2050, and 13% increase in the rainfall by the end of this century. Now, as a discussant here, I want to present 3 key findings that have been derived from the study that we did at CEW. First, through the discussions with the meetings of government officials, what came up is that we need a bottom-up approach and demand from the ULBs and municipalities from the cities. That means that we need to create awareness among the officials at the urban local bodies regarding the concept of climate change, adaptation, and resilience. It is only then that the cities will identify this as an important agenda. Also, during the discussions in Amravati and MP, the difference that lied was that Amravati was more receptive towards the concept of climate resilience. And this we attribute to the fact that since Amravati is a greenfield project, officials and planners there see as a scope to accommodate new ideas and recommendations. Also, when we were looking at the sectoral master plans across the cities, we identified few elements that existed in the current master plans. So one was from Amravati that was existing for the flood management. So that was a blue study that was done by the consultants that the government officials had hired, and they had prepared a flood management plan which contained the design of reservoirs, water channels, as well as the canal system inside the city. So that was one aspect that we found within the current plans that existed, that there is some aspect of resilience being identified. From the smart cities proposals, what we saw that government had finally recognized sanitation as an essential service, and they had decided now to expand the networks of sewage collection and stormwater. But what I want to bring notice is that these canal system, these sewage networks and stormwater drains did not accommodate the design capacity for extreme events. Also, while we looked at the sectoral plans across the cities, we identified interconnections that has also been highlighted across many discussions that we have today. For example, I want to say that if smart cities are dependent on IoT and technology-based sensors and apps which would be providing proactive information to the citizens, but what if in an extreme disaster, all the telecom and electricity provisions get disrupted? The cities won't be in a state to operate at all, and the emergency response action plans then will be at stake. Therefore, as my last point here, I just want to emphasize that we need to map the interconnections that exist between the infrastructure so that we design our response plans around them and do not avoid them. This is an important point that I again want to emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those insights. I think it's very important that it's also informed by the research that you have undertaken and the meetings that you had to get the practical experience. Our last panel member is a person from Nigeria, Mr. Tarna Manasseh Ibi. I'm not sure about the pronunciation. So welcome. Thank you very much. Let's get the perspective from Nigeria.
Welcome to the workshop. I just want to present an overview of infrastructure in Nigeria. I'm here with my colleague, he's the director in the National Emergency Management Agency, sitting over there. You may wish to know that Nigeria had a plan to be among the top 20 countries in the nation, in the world. And there are robust plans on the ground to ensure that Nigeria gets to that stage. So the National Integrated Infrastructure Master Plan was set out to raise the stock from current 20 to 25% of GDP to 70% in 2043. It's a 30-year plan. And in line with global trends, governments at all levels are expected to upscale investments across all infrastructure asset classes as well as regions and provide an enabling environment for private sector participation. Somebody talked about private sector participation earlier in the workshop. I think that Nigeria is creating an environment and is a destination to go and invest. And I guarantee you will get return on your investment. Let me not go through all this. So Nigeria is investing in different kinds of infrastructure, roads, rails, waterways, and ICT, power. And the basic sector goal for transport is to upscale road infrastructure with most high roads in good state, enhance connectivity and rehabilitate rail networks, increase emphasis on rail transportation. We have phases 2018, 2023, and 2043 in terms of short, medium, and long-term goals. There are strategic priorities in the short term. As at last year, about $24 billion was invested in roads. And there's a plan to invest up to $80 billion in 2023 and $350 billion in 2043. And this is to raise the stock of highways from about 35,000 kilometers of federal roads to about 95,000 kilometers in 2043. The railways have not been working for a period of time. Railways were working in Nigeria before, and there was a downturn. But the country now wants to go back to that and raise its stock of railways. And quite a number of projects are already ongoing at this point in time. And $5 billion has already been invested as of now in the railways. $10 billion is expected to be invested by 2023 and $75 billion in 2043. This is to bring standard gauge to 6,000 kilometers, maintain 2,750 kilometers of narrow gauge, and also work with 27 stations, 25 airports, and buy about 4,000 to 9,000 locomotives. 4 major airports, international airports, are being rehabilitated. They are in the capital city of Abuja, Lagos, Port Harcourt, and Kano in the northern part of the country. Another $5 billion are being invested, $7 billion to be invested in 2023, and about $50 billion by 2043. And this is to ensure that you raise the number of passengers being carried from 12 million in 2018 to about 110 million passengers per annum. Same thing is happening in the maritime sector, from $2 million to $7 billion to $50 billion by 2043. And you look at the details on what are the plans and how the results are expected to come. Let me skip this and go to the last slide. ICT sectors, agriculture, water mining, housing sectors. Nigeria has a population of about 200 million people, and the housing deficit is about 16 million houses. So that's a huge deficit. So Nigeria is putting in place plans, actions to ensure that that deficit is reduced over a period of time between now and 2043. And it is the plan of government to ensure that this deficit the gap is narrowed down by 2043 so that people are properly housed at that time. I want to just jump to the conclusion. In 2010, the country created an establishment called the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA. And it was tasked with the function of tackling disaster-related issues through the establishment of concrete structures. NEMA's mission was to coordinate resources towards efficient and effective disaster prevention, preparedness, mitigation, and response in Nigeria. And it acts in the following areas: coordination, disaster risk reduction, search and rescue, policy and strategy, GIS, and advocacy and education. And Nigeria is making frantic efforts to develop all hazards, critical infrastructure resilience framework for assessing the resilience of critical infrastructure systems and the economies that rely on them. We'd like to make a few recommendations or suggestions. The United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction should spearhead strong advocacy as a matter of urgency to encourage platforms for these kinds of workshops at national, regional, and sub-regional levels. We also want the UN office to create an enabling environment to help countries group together to share experience and compare notes on DRI, as we are doing here today. Given that natural disasters can be cross-border issues, countries that are already way ahead in the concept and implementation of DRI should literally drag their neighbors along in aiding information sharing and capacity building. And we also want the UN Office for DRI to begin a process to ensure that countries sign on to protocols that ensure standards of DRI are met in the building of new infrastructure and also infrastructure auditing to upgrade their status to DRI over a period of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much from Nigeria for that overview and some recommendations that we consider. I think that this brings us to the end of our initial contributions from the panel members. I would like to open up the discussion now and get some input from the floor. Please provide some comments or questions to the panel members, but also look into the questions that we are looking at during this session, and specifically some recommendations on what would be the role of the coalition and how we can ensure that that is an effective mechanism for us to implement. So can I please open up for some questions and discussion points? Yes.
This question is to Mr. Y.Mathur, Additional Secretary in NITI Aayog. So we have been talking about investment in infrastructure.
I think just check.
Yeah. So I would like to know what is the view of NITI Aayog on creating a separate mitigation fund so as to undertake certain key mitigation activities which will reduce the risk significantly. I'm not talking about the infrastructure investment, which by itself can create a risk also, not the regular infrastructure, but separate funding for mitigation works.
Could you give an example? What kind of mitigation?
You see, you can, suppose if in a particular emerging area, say let us take Chennai as a case study. The outer periphery, it doesn't have a basic infrastructure because the erstwhile irrigation lands have been converted into habitations. So there you may have to put certain underground tunnel kind of a structures, water holding structures. So that kind of a funding, whether you'll be able to do it. What is the thinking in NITI Aayog?
So I get your point. Some cities like Chennai, and you gave a good example. Cities when they sprawl and when cities, sprawl into the rural areas like you mentioned. Now those are challenges of really urban planning, and I think where we are going wrong is we are in many parts of the country adopting an American kind of planning, where we do not want to go vertical. Somehow when our cities started developing, we adopted a sprawl, we adopted low height and spread. So our cities did not go vertical. So I think those are some errors, if I may say, that we made in the past by not transforming India's cities to grow vertical and to grow compact. And we allowed a reckless sprawl to happen. And I think we should have copied the European cities and build the cities around transport rather than completely depending on the automobile and depending on the sprawl. So to cut the long story short, my sense is some cities have been damaged and we have actually urbanized, typically low-lying areas which are typically flood irrigation in some parts. So some of those practices were definitely because of wrong urban planning. And we ought to still relook at our priorities, and wherever there is resilient, where there are geographies and geologies allowing, I think we should still adopt a densification model and actually vacate and do not allow those areas to become dense where flooding and other things would occur. So of course, I have no one-size-fits-all solution, and funding has to be a part of the whole ecosystem. There cannot be a separate kitty only for a particular city so there is no thinking to create a fund specifically, but the NDMA is working in areas and then they are guiding where, so of course it would need detailed studies, and I'm sure at the national level and in partnership with the state governments, the funding is really not a problem. It can be found out. The challenge is, even if you designed a plan for it, who would implement it? So if there is some detailing done, and in the case of Chennai, there are some proposals I'm aware of which they're seeking multilateral bank funding, but you may be aware. So they are proposing a big borrowing from multilateral banks for that specific challenge.
Thank you for that insight. And let's have another question from the floor.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Brigadier Kuldeep Singh from NDMA, sir. I have a rather complex question on resilient cities and this thing. The first point that I want to make is, as you're well aware, biodiversity has got very intricate linkages with human survival. Now, industrialization is responsible for climate change, and together they are both leading up to what is now known as the sixth mass extinction, which is in the offing. People are not aware of that.
So what's the question?
Yeah, the question is, smart cities are not necessarily green cities. Resilient cities, when you make resilient infrastructure, extensive infrastructure, they are not necessarily always green, always amenable to biodiversity. That's point one. Now, India, especially, very rightly you have said that we have been trying to supplant purely European or foreign models, whereas there has to be an Indian model. Now, India is in many ways geopolitical terms, an island. We are surrounded by sea on 3 sides, Karakoram, Pakistan, China. There's no place to expand, and 1.34 billion population. With increased food preferences, the need for industrialization to pull people out of poverty and pull up through GDP, as also the need for resilient and disaster-resilient infrastructure. The struggle, there's an emerging conflict between land for these conflicting requirements. All 3 require land in their separate spaces. Agrarian, you need land. For industrialization, you need land. Urban spaces, you need land, etc. So what is also happening is, what I notice is that there is a discrete encroachment happening on the remaining biospheres. How do we look at this from the NITI Aayog's point of view? That's my question.
I'm sorry, you're from NDMA.
Yes.
And you're from NDMA, you are asking me a question. In fact, you should give NITI Aayog the answers. Rather than, but I think, please sit down.
Sir.
I think this is an international panel, so let's open up. It's not only an India issue. The point, I think, what was flagged was that we need to look at what the question really, and this panel is focused about, how do we build the coalitions and how do we learn and how do we really build bridges and share information and best practices. So I think that is the focus. And what you said is right. If there is a biodiversity that is getting impacted because of infrastructure not being risk resilient, so we really need to capture the data. And I think without data being captured upfront and then getting in what are the events like Mr. Uma Maheshwaran was mentioning in the cities of India, and he gave you a breakdown of the smart cities. And he mentioned what have been the incidents. I think that was an 18-year period from 2000 till 2018.